All right. Oh, thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today. Hi, I'm Casey Smith. I'm on staff here with the Alliance. That was Time Bricky. If you appreciated his performance, feel free to throw some love for him into the chat function. If you've been on our webinars before, you know we like to start them with a little performance from a local artist to center us, bring a little bit of joy, give us a moment to shut out the noise of the day. Just a couple of housekeeping notes, then I'll be handing it over. There is a chat function, so you can use that if you have resources to share or comments on what's happening, but we'll also be doing a Q&A at the end of the webinar. And if you sent a pre-submitted question, we do have those. So you don't need to resubmit those if you've already submitted a question. But if you have a new question that comes up, you can put them in the Q&A box. So it's on the bottom of your screen. Cool function, if you haven't used this before, when a question pops up in that Q&A box, there'll be a little thumbs up like symbol underneath it. If you click that, that question will actually go to the top. So if you see a question that's really vibing with you, if you see a question that you also have, you think is really important to get answered on this webinar, please like it, and that will help us kind of prioritize that. This webinar is being recorded and will be available after the fact. And if there's any questions that we don't get to, we will make sure to answer those after the webinar is over. You can also join our Facebook group, IL, Illinois Arts Action Network. We'll be dropping more answers and resources in that for you as we kind of navigate what this phase 4 reopening looks like. And with that, I'm gonna hand it over to our wonderful, brilliant policy wonk, nerd extraordinaire, Jonathan VanderBrug, for a general COVID update before we get in with our panelist, Jason Horowitz. So Jonathan, take it away.
Can you introduce me everywhere, every time?
Yes, but there will be a charge. So.
Oh, okay. Well, we'll work that out later. We'll work that. I'm going to share my screen now. We're going to give a brief update on everything that's happening, and there's a lot happening with COVID and arts policy. So here we go. Hopefully this will work. Can you see it? Let's see. Can you see the PowerPoint? All right. Let me get this going here. Okay, thumbs up, Casey, if you can see it. All right. A lot has happened in the world of COVID and arts policy just in the last 2 weeks. And we're going to do a quick rundown and talk about the ways that we as the Alliance are advocating for you. What is the status of the next wave of relief? Well, it is not certain that there will be a next wave of relief at the federal level. Keep in mind, localities and the state do not have a lot of cash. And so we are really looking to the federal government, which has the biggest checkbook, in order to get some relief, continued relief from COVID. The House Democrats passed the HEROES Act a while back, but unfortunately it's dead on arrival in the Senate. And we're really right now at a stalemate. Now this makes us nervous because Congress, the GOP in the Senate has said that talks will not resume until Congress is back from 2-week break. And that's not going to be until July 21. And keep in mind that a lot of the unemployment enhancements, such as the $600 per week, expire on July 31. So we are watching this very, very closely. What are the prospects? What are the politics at play? Well, we're seeing two very different visions of what this next round of relief will be. Donald Trump has called for a second round of direct payments and has also, let me see if I can get this back. He's also called for infrastructure investments. That's not been received well by his colleagues in the Senate. They are very much taking a narrative and emphasizing a narrative of back to work. So the GOP in the Senate is emphasizing liability protections for businesses and ending the enhanced unemployment benefits. And it's really coming down to the jobs report. The GOP narrative is that, hey, look we added 2.5 million workers last month. However, there were also 1.5 million new unemployment claims. So sometimes they don't always match. People are added here, but jobs taken away elsewhere. And so they see the economy as coming back. 1.5 million is a lot last week of new claims, but it's not as much as it was the week before. So it's whether you want to see it as a glass half full or a glass half empty or completely empty. The Dems, on the other hand, are still emphasizing relief. So they are advocating for the continuation of the enhanced unemployment. And importantly, they're also advocating for more money for the states. That is very important to us in Illinois because we have a $7.4 billion budget shortfall. And one of the reasons why we were able to have level funding for the Illinois Arts Council this year is in large part due to the expectation that the federal government will provide relief to Illinois and other states. So July 2 is a very big day because the jobs report will come out. If it looks better, the prospects are, it's inverse. The prospects are more unlikely for relief. If the job report looks worse, there'll be more pressure to have bigger relief package. There has been a lot of activity in the business side of relief. Many of you are aware of the Paycheck Protection Program loans, which can go to nonprofits and to independent contractors as well as for-profit businesses. For a while that ran out of money, but now after being replenished, there is still money left, but the deadline is June 30, so do not wait. The program, there's no guarantee at all that it will be extended after June 30. There's been some changes that make the loans a little bit more friendly. I won't go through all of those, but the one I want to highlight is that previously, before a recent legislation was passed to make it more flexible, you had only 8 weeks to spend the loan, and they looked at payroll over that 8 weeks. You now have much more time. You have 24 weeks. And just earlier this week on Tuesday, the Treasury Department, SBA, clarified that if you spend the money before the 24 weeks, you don't have to wait to submit your forgiveness request, your application. You can do that much earlier. 2 other developments in the loan small business nonprofit side. The economic injury disaster loans, those are loans that aren't made through banks, but are made directly through the Small Business Administration. They were offline, but they're back online now. They're a little bit different. They apply to the same crowd as the PPP loans. However, they're not forgivable. The good part about them, though, is if you apply and are accepted, you could get an advance of up to $1,000 per employee. So now that that program is online, again, don't wait to apply for that. And we can provide some information in the chat about how you can find more information. You can receive both a PPP loan and a disaster loan at the same time if you carefully track that the money is going to different places. And then finally, for businesses and nonprofits that are bigger, that are too big to get an economic injury disaster loan or a PPP loan, after many problems, the Main Street Lending Program has been launched, and that is aimed towards the bigger fish, towards nonprofits and businesses that have between 500 and 15,000 employees. So if you're of that size, take a look into that. They are, right now it's only limited to the for-profit. However, they are considering opening it to nonprofits, and that is one of the areas that we are advocating for in calling that it be open to nonprofits and kind of be your voice as they seek to make that decision. And some final notes. One thing at the state level that we want to emphasize is an important step by DCEO. They've issued what's called business interruption grants, and I love the acronym, they're big. So you can use all caps too. The business interruption grants are specified for small businesses. It comes from money from the CARES Act. So this is an example of the federal money filtering down through the states. The first round of business interruption grants, and I emphasize it's just the first round, not all of it, is targeted towards bars and restaurants and to fitness centers. we are advocating and asking the governor who supports the creative sector, asking that the next round be, some of the funds be dedicated, 50 million be dedicated to the creative sector. As you know, that we're struggling and will take us longer probably to open. And opening is what we're going to talk about today, the reopening. Two resources, I have office hours every Friday. So if you have any questions about unemployment or about policy, because who doesn't want to talk policy on a Friday morning? You can sign up. I'll put the registration link in the chat. You can talk about your cat or dog too if you want to, as long as we eventually get to policy. But it's a good time to provide some very specialized assistance. And then Lawyers for the Creative Arts, if you have a legal related question or anything a little bit more specific, you can always contact them. So that is the news from DC. That's kind of the context in which we're going to talk about Illinois' reopening. Back to you. Well, actually, I'm not going to go back to you, Casey. We're going to go to Claire. I'm not going to do as good an introduction as Casey, Claire, but you don't need an introduction. People know you. You are Claire Rice, Executive Director of Arts Alliance, Illinois.
Thanks, Jonathan.
Here she is.
Always appreciate the deep policy dive that we get from Jonathan. So I just wanted to contextualize today's conversation for just a minute, and then I'll turn it right over to Jason, our colleague at GCEO, who we are already working with on round 2 of the big grants, and trying to provide data and justification and information for them to support our ask of particularly focusing on the creative industries in the next round of those big grants. So know that DCO hears us, they're working with us, and that process is already underway, and your advocacy action, your support for that action campaign that we have out there right now will only underscore the importance of that work. So thank you to Jason in advance also for that work. And for his participation on today's call. But we know the reopening conversation is a really challenging one for this sector. We were one of the first to close. We're in the business of large public gatherings. That means a lot to us as a sector. It's our lifeblood. It's our economic blood. And so that we know that this is a really challenging conversation. We've been very pleased to be included at the table for these conversations as guidelines have been developed and put in place, both at the state level and within the city of Chicago. We're going to focus on the state guidelines today. We have resources for those of you in the city of Chicago. The Business Affairs and Consumer Protection, BACP, has put out a webinar on the Chicago guidelines, and today's conversation will be focused on the state guidelines. And we may as well do some deep dives on the specific industries within the creative sector, so museums, performing arts venues, cinema houses, film, etc., to get a little bit more nuance because of the working groups. The working groups have done a lot of work to apply these guidelines and give folks a little more meat on the bones of how we're going to make these guidelines work. So today will be an overview, and I'm sure Jason will be able to entertain a lot of questions. But we just want you to know that this reopening, particularly early in phase 4, with limitations of gatherings of 50 people, we know that's not, it's not where we need to be as a sector in terms of our reopening. And the state knows that too, the city knows that, government knows that, but public health has to come first. And that's where these guidelines come from. We hope some of you have seen the stepwise risk level, and as our risk level goes down with public health, the according loosening of those capacity caps over phase 4. So it's not that as though we're going to go, straight from phase 4 into phase 5, all or nothing, right? There will be some loosening and stepwise work that we will be able to do across this phase, and we appreciate DCO's partnership in those conversations and our city and municipal level conversations as well. So I just wanted you all to hear that, we know these guidelines are not what we would love for them to be, but we need to take this slow from a public health perspective. And so we'll start here. We'll answer questions. I'm going to turn it over to Jason, and really appreciate Jason and Kara and Michael and all of our colleagues at DCEO, including the arts, in the development of these guidelines. It's really important to have industry at the table, even if we don't always agree with public health on exactly where we want to land on this stuff. Our voices are being heard, and we are there in dialogue, in conversation with representatives from industry, and we're very happy to be there. So there are states around the country where these decisions are being made without the voices of the arts at the table. So thank you, Jason, for that, and we'll turn it over to you to give an overview of the guidelines.
Sure. Thank you, Claire. And yeah, thank you guys for having me here. I'm a big fan of the arts myself. It's pretty personal to me. I was in theater a long time ago, a lifetime ago. It seems like I'm still, you know, play in a couple bands around the city in Chicago. So, you know, I understand how important the arts are to, you know, making the state of Illinois really what it is, and you know, for the well-being of folks in our state, and obviously for the economic engine for our state as well. So, you know, I'm happy to be here with you all and share this info. So Restore Illinois, I'll start. Let me share my screen first. Let's see. There we go. So I'm going to start by talking about, just very briefly, what Restore Illinois is for folks that might not be familiar with this. And then I'll talk specifically about the guidelines themselves as they apply to, I'll probably go into detail on theaters and performing arts, and then museums. And, you know, there are plenty of other guidelines as well if folks are interested in looking at a particular other area. And then I'll also talk about the resources that we have that are available to employers or managers in those industries to really help them make sure that they understand the guidelines, and also be able to, you know, make sure that they're in compliance and provide training. There's a range of resources that are available to companies in Illinois. So what is Restore Illinois? So it's a 5-phase plan to reopen Illinois, guided by health metrics. So the first phase was when, you know, cases were really ramping up quickly. There was wide community spread. The second phase was when the curve kind of flattened out, and there was a slight expansion beyond sort of the initial essential businesses in phase 2. Phase 3 is what we are currently in. It started at the end of May, and it allowed for, you know, people were allowed to go into retail. There were certain types of outdoor recreation that were allowed. It's a long list, a broader range of manufacturing, so on and so forth. Phase 4 is it's called Revitalize Illinois, and essentially it's 28 days after phase 3. If the trends are still looking good, which they are right now, so we're hopeful that in just a couple days we'll be entering into phase 4. There's going to be a much broader set of industries that can operate. Now, there's still going to be pretty tight restrictions on capacity, sanitation requirements, encouraging distancing, wearing masks, all those sorts of details to really ensure that even as these industries open, things are safe. So the goal here is to basically gradually open the economy. As we open it, make sure there are safety guidelines in place that prevent the spread of COVID, and then just keep an eye on the metrics as we do that to make sure that we're not going backwards. And if we do find, if a situation does come up where there's a spike, then we might need to revert to a previous phase in the plan. And we've outlined, you know, all those parameters that, you know, that all the public health parameters, for example, hospital capacity, testing rates. There's a few other ones, and you can find those at the IDPH website if you're interested. So phase 4, as I was mentioning, there's going to be quite a few things allowed in phase 4 that were not allowed in phase 3. We'll be in phase, this is a very optimistic slide. I said, as long as things go well, but I guess this is tomorrow, right? So very unlikely that a spike happens between right now and tomorrow. So we will be entering phase 4 as of June 26th. Some of the main things that will be allowed in phase 4, gatherings of 50 people or fewer as opposed to 10 or fewer in phase 3. In phase 3, non-essential travel was not permitted, and now non-essential travel will be permitted as long as it follows IDPH and CDC recommendations. All sorts of healthcare are allowed, again, within IDPH guidelines. Education and childcare will be allowed. All outdoor recreation is now allowed. And then there's a range of new categories as well. And those new categories include museums, zoos, theaters, and performing arts, seated spectator events, so ticketed only, and it has to be outdoors. So ticketed, so, I'm actually confused by this, sorry. Seated spectator, so indoor spectator events are allowed if they are ticketed. Obviously, that's very relevant to many people on this call. Outdoor spectator events are also allowed if they are ticketed. Restaurants and bars, meetings and social events, and then select indoor and outdoor recreation. So we have a set of guides that you can use that are available at our website. And when I'm done going through this presentation, I'll actually go to our website and show you how to navigate to that. And there's some really useful tools and resources for you. There's a set of guidelines for each one of these different types of workplaces. So there's a guideline for museums, guidelines for performing arts. There's guidelines, I assume most people on this call also have offices. So there's guidelines for the office space that you're in as well. So the recommendation is if you have different, if different components of your business have different workspace types, then you're going to want to use the guideline set that's relevant to that type of workspace. You can download signs that you can post. There's a guide for training your employees. There's a checklist to make sure that you've sort of thought of all the different things that you need to think of in order to comply with the guidelines. And again, I'll show an example of this after I go through this presentation. So before I dig into the guidelines, just want to talk a little bit about the public health approach to thinking through these guidelines. And before I get into that, I just want to sort of echo something that Claire said at the beginning. This has been a pretty collaborative process. We've been talking with IDPH. Obviously, the public health considerations are #1 here. So basically, every guideline that we have to discuss with IDPH and make sure that they're comfortable with it. But across all of the different industries that we've been working with, we've had, for each industry, it's got to be at least 5 or 6 different meetings with a dozen different stakeholders. And we really wanted to have a conversation to say, look, here's the public health concern. Here's the recommended guideline. Does that make sense? Is there an easier way or less burdensome way to accomplish this? Does this seem arbitrary, or is there something else that might work better for you? So it's been a really collaborative process between industry, DCEO, IDPH, and our outside consultants that were helping support this process. So the factors that we considered in developing these guidelines: duration, how long does a typical interaction last between, say, customers and employees, or between employees? Nature of contact, so are there common surfaces? Ventilation, do workers or customers breathe the same air in a confined space? Screening and removal, so how do we make sure that employees are properly screened and they're not spreading COVID in the workplace? Number of contacts, so how many interactions might occur daily? And then finally, proximity, so how physically close do customers or workers have to be as they're doing their job? For each of the different guidelines, so as I said at the beginning, we have a different set of guidelines for each one of these workplace types. So there's a performing arts and theater, set of guidelines, there's a museum set of guidelines, there's an office set of guidelines, manufacturing, so on and so forth. Each one of these guidelines has generally the same guidance for general health, HR and travel policy, and health monitoring, so that includes employee screening. In addition to that, there's a range of categories that are very specific to each workplace, right? So there's physical workspace. How should you, I guess in the space of a theater, for example, you know, orient your workspace at the ticket booth, among the seats, so that you're allowing for social distancing, for example. Disinfecting and cleaning procedures, staffing and attendance, external interactions, so that might include how do you want to interact with vendors, for example, and then customer behaviors, how are we encouraging customers to behave while they're in the space. So I'll touch on museums and theaters here, and then again, this is high level, and I'll show you guys in a minute what the full set of guidelines looks like, and we can get into a little bit more into the weeds. For museums, there's a capacity limit of no more than 25% occupancy at any given time. Facilities should have plans to mitigate congregation and ticketing areas. So that might include advanced ticketing or staggering arrival times. Guided tours are limited to 50 guests or fewer, and audio tour equipment must be cleaned before and after use. I should say that Chicago is now saying that museums cannot have guided tours. So just for those in Chicago who are thinking about this, the state guidelines are really a floor, right? So everywhere in the state has to abide by at least these guidelines, but individual local governments can apply their own guidelines that exceed that. Hands-on exhibits in museums are required to be closed or modified to eliminate a hands-on component. Guests are required to wear face coverings over their nose and mouth, but they can remove them in outdoor exhibits that allow for proper distancing. And then finally, concessions are allowed, but we do have additional guidelines. They have to basically follow the same guidelines that restaurants and bars have to follow. On theaters, again, just these are some of the highlights. I'll show you guys the full guidelines in a few minutes. There's a capacity limit of lesser of 50 people or 50% of the venue's seating. Now, to be clear, if there are multiple theaters within or multiple physical spaces within a given, theater complex, that limit applies to each one of those spaces, right? So you can have up to 50 people within each space. Events must be ticketed and seated, so no general admission, and at least 6 feet between seats occupied by patrons that are not members of the same household or party. There's guidelines about cleaning and disinfecting. Patrons are required to wear face coverings. They do not have to keep them on if they are seated at their seat within the venue. And then again, with concessions, there are separate guidelines related that are similar to bars and restaurants. And so, sorry, so when I was speaking earlier and confusing myself about seated spectator events, so spectator events are exclusive of performing. So there's the performing arts and theaters guidance, and then spectator events would be separate. So like, a sporting event, for example, those are the separate guidelines. And currently, indoor seated spectator events are not permitted. And again, that applies to things like sporting events. That does not apply to theater and performing arts. Here's some other highlights here. I'm not sure if it's worth really getting in the weeds on these. I would prefer to show you the website, which I will pull up momentarily. Okay, so there's a website called GCE COVID-19 resources.com. And this is actually more than just the Restore Illinois guidelines. I recommend anyone to check it out. There's several resources on here, including resources for businesses that are trying to better understand federal aid or state programs that are available for them, for example. Today, I'm going to focus on Restore Illinois. So you can see here right at the top, there is a Restore Illinois button, and then Restore Illinois Phase 3 or Restore Illinois Phase 4. So Phase 4 guidelines, you can see that there's a different set of resources for these different categories of industries. We'll look at theater and performing arts. And then it says up here, okay, what's included in theaters and performing arts? Guidelines apply to ticketed events, general admission shows without seating are not permitted. So before I click on the guidelines, let me just show you guys what's here. There's the guidelines, there's posters here, both graphic posters and posters with text on them. There's checklists that you can, as you're reopening, just make sure you've checked all these boxes that are relevant to your operations. There's a toolkit that sort of captures everything in one place. And then in the general, I believe it's in the general location. There's also should be guidance somewhere. I'm probably making people dizzy here, scrolling through this stuff. There's guidance on training as well. Under Restore, that might just be here in the general Restore. Well, I'll get back to you guys with that if I can't seem to find it at the moment. Apologize for that. So industry guidelines. So here's what the theater and performing arts industry guidelines look like. As I mentioned, sort of those top 3 categories that are basically common to all industries. These are the recommendations. So I'm not going to read all this out to you. Employees should wear face coverings when they're within 6 feet of others. Social distance of at least 6 feet. Hand washing and sanitizer should be available. Travel, again, non-essential travel is allowed, but there's CDC guidelines for when it's appropriate to travel. Health monitoring, this is one that I do want to point out for theaters because, I think live performing is an area where is one of the few professions where you might not be able to wear a mask when you're not able to social distance. If you're acting, for example, and you're in a play, not every, it would be pretty bad theater if everyone is going to try to stay 6 feet apart at all times. Although I'm sure IDPH, my colleagues at IDPH would prefer if they would do that. So we do recommend, this is unique to theater, that people undergo a COVID test for all live performers within 48 to 72 hours prior to the start of work on set or location, just because it is higher risk and they can't wear masks and social distance while they're actually performing. Now that is an encouraged best practice. We can't require people to do that. They're allowed to refuse it, but it's a recommendation. Going down to physical workspace, there's recommendations for signage, clearly indicating face covering requirements, social distancing guidelines, etc. on your website for people who purchase tickets, allowing 6 feet of spacing between occupied ticketing workstations or an impermeable barrier if that's not possible. For live performances, all individuals should maintain 6 feet of social distancing unless job duty cannot be performed without proximity. So for example, that might be actors in the middle of a performance or hair or makeup, costumes, that sort of thing. Should wear face coverings if practical. So for example, string instrument performers, they should wear face coverings. Obviously woodwind, not really gonna work. So again, I'm not gonna go through all of these in too much detail. Here's another one that I think is probably worth flagging. You are allowed to have live indoor performances with an audience. If the first row of seating is within 6 feet of the stage, then any seating within the 6 feet of stage should be closed, or there should be an impermeable barrier between the stage and patrons. There's a series of recommended best practices here again, which are, not strict guidelines, but these are areas that it's a recommendation, but we understand that not every, facility, either due to its layout or just its resources, would be able to comply with these practices. Disinfecting and cleaning. Clean and disinfect common areas frequently, every 30 minutes recommended for high traffic areas. So for example, the bathrooms during an actual performance should be cleaned quite regularly. Cleaning and disinfecting occupied tables and seats between use by different groups. Minimize the sharing of high touch props and equipment between non-household participants. Let's see, I'll go to staffing and attendance. I know a lot of folks are probably interested in this one. Indoor venues should operate at lesser of 50 guests or 50% of the overall theater or performance space capacity. You need to have a plan to allow for social distancing within the venue. I know that when we were on some of these calls with performing arts venues, they mentioned that there are actually some ticketing apps now that allow you, or ticketing software that sort of automates giving people the opportunity to choose seats that are 6 feet away from a set of seats that's already been chosen. So those resources are available. I think an important consideration here is really making sure that people can continue to distance even in ingress and egress as they're coming into the venue and exiting the venue. So there's some recommendations here on staggering show starting in it, or staggering patron arrival times, for example. Limiting the number of unscheduled entries, designating a specific point of entry, releasing patrons by row. Again, these are all sort of recommendations, and you'll sort of need to decide what works best depending on how your venue is structured. For external suppliers or non-patron visitors, you should ask whether the supplier is currently exhibiting COVID-19 symptoms, and there's IDPH actually has a resource that employers can use that shows what questions need to be asked for a COVID-19 screening. Again, for customer behaviors, I touched on this before. Patrons should wear face coverings over their nose and mouth except while seated within a venue. And then patrons should check for available capacity before going to the facility. So I think actually one thing I didn't highlight, which I know Casey had mentioned, was a question that some folks are interested in. Indoor venues should operate at lesser of 50 guests or 50% of overall theater or performance space capacity. So guests means audience, right? So that does not include the performers when you're counting up to 50. I'm sure there's a lot of questions. I could run through museums real quick, but why don't I just pause there and go ahead and let folks ask questions that they might have. Unless it seems like folks are really interested in the museum, running through the museum one quickly as well.
Jason, I would suggest that you just maybe touch on the differences between, because a lot of the first few guidelines, sets of guidelines are the same, right? Around, so it's around capacity and some of the staffing stuff. So if you want to just touch on some of the differences for museums, we can do that. But I think people can also start to ask their questions while you're, we've got
sure.
Back and
forth
actually, questions and museums.
Sounds good. I'll run through museums quickly. And one thing before I forget, the Chicago guidelines actually cap capacity at 25% for theaters right now. There's some other, I think relatively minor differences in theaters, but I would say that's really the big one, where Chicago and Illinois are different in their guidelines. It's a 25% capacity limit. Okay, so I'll go ahead and go to museums.
So yes, Edward, to your question, in your auditorium, your stage and the audience can be considered two separate gatherings. So as Jason just said, so the audience is one gathering, and then your performers, your backstage crew, etc., is another gathering that's to be limited to 50 with separate restrooms, separate entrances, etc. And then Jason, I'll have you touch on the piece of his question around general admission seating versus it. I think the idea, Edward, there, and Jason, correct me if I'm wrong, is to avoid a lack of social distancing in GA seating. He's asking around, you know, they want to do general admissions so they can be spaced and have ushers ensure it versus assigning seats.
Okay, yeah, that's a good question. I mean, that's a situation, I suppose, where there's not really any risk of general admission resulting in a, you know, failure to social distance. I mean, I'll double check on that. I mean, as the recommendation stands, they want you to do ticketed seating just to make sure that risk isn't there. But I'll check on whether, you know, a situation where you are basically complying with that in all but the actual, you know, in spirit, and all but the actual written, you know, strict interpretation of that. I'll see if that's an issue, and I can get back to Claire with that.
I think it makes sense for us to move on to the Q&A portion here. And we're actually going to be doing a museum-specific webinar next week, so we'll get out more information about that. But if we're all okay with it, I would actually love to bring in Chris Audain, who's going to be moderating the Q&A and has a bunch of those pre-submitted questions that we definitely want to get to, as we only have about 12 minutes left here. Are you cool with that, Jason?
I'm fine with it.
All right. Well, quit sharing your screen so we can see your beautiful face.
Okay.
There we go.
Hey, Jason, how's it going?
Good. How are you, Chris?
Good, good. So I just got a bunch of questions, and just going to ask them, and we'll talk through them, and maybe you'll help bring some clarity to them. And so the first one is about dressing rooms. And the question is, are there any guidelines for dressing rooms in particular? Because they're often very small, performers close together. Yeah, is there anything about dressing rooms?
So the recommendation, that's a great question. I'm not sure if we address them specifically. You know, the recommendation is for all individuals should maintain 6 feet of social distancing unless job duty cannot be performed without proximity. So, for example, if you need support with a costume, like putting on a costume, you know, that would be permitted. Obviously, someone can be within 6 feet of you to put on a costume. But I think the recommendation here would be to that you would not be able to use a dressing room, or you wouldn't be able to have so many people in a dressing room that they cannot maintain social distancing.
And I think we would also want to direct folks to the personal services guidelines too, like around hair and makeup and all of that, where there are some guidelines around hair salons and stylists and things like this that exist for the other industries, and we can get those guidelines out to folks too.
Yeah, that's a great point. And the one other place where dressing room comes up is in disinfecting. So you'll want to make sure that you're cleaning and disinfecting those common areas relatively frequently.
Okay, the next one is about the difference between state and city guidelines, and how there's sometimes a disconnect. And an example would be limits for indoor versus outdoor events, the scaling of participation, 50 versus 100, and whether balconies are considered a second space or room. Are you able at all to help understand how folks should look at these varying standards and efforts to consolidate them, perhaps?
Yeah, so the state is the floor, right? So if there's a state guideline that is more restrictive than a city guideline, then the state guideline takes precedence. And so, for example, you mentioned 50 versus 100. I understand that in one of the versions of the city guidelines, there's at least one area where they allow for up to 100 people. The city guide or the state guidelines only allow for up to 50, so the requirement there is up to 50. The balconies question, that's a good one. So the city guidelines distinguish between, they allow for separate balconies to be considered separate groups of 50, for example?
Well, go ahead, Claire.
Oh, I was going to say, I think the state aligned with that, Jason. If I
Yeah, I believe so too. But let me, I don't want to say the wrong thing there.
Yeah, I think I'm 99% sure that yes, as long as there are separate facilities and that actually entrances can be timed to keep the groups separate, that was an accommodation that both the state and city were able to make, that if you have separate restroom facilities and you can time entrances to keep the groups apart, then you are allowed to consider balconies as a separate gathering. So you could have a main floor gathering and a balcony gathering.
Yeah, I think that's correct as well, but I'll just confirm that.
Yeah.
All right. And then this one is about the crowd scenes. And if there's 50 people in a scene on a stage, or dancers perhaps, is the social distance required for that? You may have covered this.
Yeah, so social distance is not required in the course of actors or dancers performing. The rule is that basically people have to social distance, or they're required to be wearing a mask in all scenarios where they're doing their job does not permit it.
Okay, this next question is about the reopening schedule. So Illinois is on track to open Friday, but more than half the country is trending the opposite direction, and increasingly so. What's the plan if the numbers begin to rise in Illinois?
Sure, so that's a good question. Hopefully one that we don't have to ever act on. But so there are, if you look at Restore Illinois, from when it was first released, there are conditions written in there that say here are the conditions under which we'll have to revert back to a previous phase, and they involve, for example, a localized significant spike in cases, or a reduction in hospital capacity beyond a certain percentage of available beds. And all this information is available. If you look at the plan, let me see if I can pull this up quickly enough to just give it to you for this phase. No, I'm not there, and I won't waste any more time. But yeah, it's at dph.illinois.gov/restore. There's a bunch of details there about the data they're looking at, where we are on the data for different regions, and then the plan itself that outlines the circumstances where we would have to go back to an earlier phase.
Okay, this question just came in now. Seated and ticket seems to be used a lot. My company is brainstorming an outdoor standing unticketed dance performance, a la performances in the park. Is there any guidance on this?
Unfortunately, outdoor general admission events are not currently permitted. If you can find a way to convert that event into a ticketed seating event, then it would be permitted. And so let me expand a little bit. So Claire alluded to this actually before I spoke, and I forgot to mention it during the presentation. So there's a long time between the beginning of phase 4 and phase 5. And the guidelines that I just described are the guidelines for the beginning of phase 4. And the expectation is that there will be a phase 4B, phase 4C, phase 4D. I don't know how many different subphases there will be, but as long as the trend lines remain low, there will be continued relaxation of these guidelines over time. And I know that people really want to plan, right? So our goal is to actually publish, okay, here's what will be allowed in phase 4B and 4C, and what the parameters will be for us to actually get there. And I would expect something like outdoor general admission events to be one of the items that we allow relatively early in phase 4. But unfortunately, it's not allowed at this time.
Yeah, and I think in the conversations we had with DCO initially, I mean, I think the worry there is, of course, the large scale of that. You think Lollapalooza, you think about massive events, and I think folks are worried about crossing paths and coming and going, and lots of density. But I know that people have also been able to, there have been some innovations around circles on the lawn that have actually been, seated and assigned. So people have innovated a little bit on some of these outdoor events to kind of make them more of a ticketed scenario versus a kind of a general admission event. So we've seen a little bit of innovation in that space already. And then to Jason's point around the phases, the city of Chicago has already come up with that slide, which we can publicize to folks in terms of this is what we need to see in terms of moderate risk, low to moderate risk, low risk, et cetera. And the corresponding numbers accordingly. And then we're looking for the DCO IDPH version of that to come out. Hopefully, do you guys have a time frame on that yet? Not yet. Soon.
I'd be getting myself in trouble if I gave you one. I mean, it's just a situation where a lot of different people have to sign off on it before we can.
For sure.
So I'm hopeful it's soon, but I unfortunately.
It's coming. It's coming.
Right.
Thank you for that. We appreciate that.
Okay, so are there any DCO stage 4 guidelines for musicians who perform for musical theater productions in an orchestra pit? It's very specific.
Yes, there are. So I already mentioned the one about wearing masks and how, the ones that can wear it should, the ones that can't should not. They should allow for social distancing. If you are, for example, in an orchestra pit that does not allow for that, we recommend, I think it's under best practices. Let me look this up to make sure I don't say the wrong thing here.
And Jason, can you stay on for an extra maybe 5 minutes to answer a couple more questions?
Absolutely. Yeah.
If folks want to stick around for another 5. Chris, you got a few minutes?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Stay around for a few minutes to answer some of these further questions.
Yeah, so face coverings I mentioned. If space is limited during live performance, we recommend as a best practice finding a way to do a remote pit option. I'm not quite sure how that would work, but some people, are very innovative and I guess can pull that off. So those are really the main ones. I guess another one is, we really recommend that where it's practical, performers are using their own equipment, so they're not sharing any equipment with others. And if they can't do that, then the equipment should be properly sanitized between use.
All right. So another one is someone saying that they, says, we plan general admission seating so audience members can be spaced widely across the auditorium and would have ushers ensure social distancing. So in that event, it has to be general admission seating rather than assigned seating, according to them. But the guidelines say you cannot have general admission. How would they remedy this, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, just as I think that, frankly, if you're in a situation where you can ensure that customers are all seated in a place where they're adequately socially distanced, to me, that seems like it's in compliance with what we're trying to go for here. But I'll need to double check on that.
Is the ticketing more about ensuring the number of people there that are coming? Is that more what it's about in this case, in regards to this?
I think it is. I think it's also about, I mean, there's all kinds of things with general admission that make things more difficult. It's more than just the seating. I think it's like the coming and going. It's the making sure that it's less than 50 people. It's, you know, so you mentioned ushers. So, you know, if there weren't general admission, then the ushers aren't trying to show people to their seats, then it might be easier for the ushers to socially distance from the audience, for example. So, that's just a few examples of where, you know, even that circumstance, which is generally in compliance, might result in, you know, slightly more risk than if you just turn that into a ticketed seated event.
Is there a plan for reevaluation of phase 4 guidelines at any point, or are there any conditions that would alter the current guidelines?
Yeah, so as I said, we'll be reevaluating over time, and we're hoping to release very soon, you know, how they would change and under what conditions over time.
Okay, I got another one just coming in. How do these guidelines apply to outdoor art festivals?
Art festivals. So that is a good question.
So if someone's selling and showing their art, you know, to sell.
Right.
You have the same outdoor attractions guidelines that the city does, Jason? I can't remember. I haven't looked.
So there is I think that might fit under
a different set, right?
Yeah, that would go under a different category. So there's meetings and social events. Trying to decide if that's where that would go.
We can, yeah, we'll get.
Yeah, let me get back to you on that.
On that one.
All right. I think this might be one of the last ones. So, or maybe there's two here. We would have ticketing zones that people purchase a seat and work. I think one hang up is that we're rearranging our venues to provide distanced seating, and building those floor maps into our ticketing systems might not be possible.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I understand how technically that's sort of a difficult challenge for quite a few venues. I think that, to me, that, you know, I don't think we want to micromanage, you know, how you accommodate this. You know, the general rule is that you need to find a way to make sure that parties are 6 feet apart and when they're seated in your venue. And you know that if you, however, is a way for you to pull that off, I think is generally good with us. We're not trying to micromanage the process for getting there.
Thanks. All right, I've got 2 more right now, and so I'll go ahead and ask them. If we run out of time, we'll stop. Can you tell us more about the different phases within phase 4 that was mentioned before? Where would we find this information to share with our board?
So it's not out there yet from the state. I'll tell you that the types of things that you might expect to change, there's probably not going to be a significant change in recommendations on social distancing or mask wearing, for example, at least not anytime soon. But the places where you're going to see changes are probably on the capacity limit, at least the ones that would be most relevant to this group. You'd start to see it allowed to go higher than 50 people or higher than 50%.
And we can get out the city of Chicago ones just as an example, but know again that the state will set the floor on how that works. But you can just see kind of how one city is thinking about it, that we can get out to folks.
Yeah, I guess I'll ask this other one. I kind of know the answer, but maybe some others don't. If Performing Arts Center is part of a community college, do they have to follow openings for schools first?
I mean, I guess it depends on the context. My gut reaction is no. I think that if you are, you know, having events in the Performing Arts Center, that it doesn't matter whether the school is open or not, or how the school has opened. Those they can go ahead and do their events in compliance with the state guidelines related to performing arts centers.
Yeah. Anything else, Jonathan or Casey, to add?
No?
All right, that's all from me. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks so much for moderating, Chris. I'm going to drop into the chat a link to a YouTube of a webinar that's for the Chicago specific guidelines. So that could be helpful for folks. If we didn't get to your question, I apologize. Or if the question wasn't totally answered, we'll try and get those answers, follow up with Jason and get those answers out to you. Obviously, as you can tell by some of the puzzled, stumped looks on Jason's face to some of our questions, this is still an active, you know, live figuring out what these guidelines mean and how this reopening can actually happen safely. So thank you to everyone just for like being patient during this moment of extraordinary stress and trauma for all of us and all of our organizations. If you are on Facebook, join our Facebook group, IL Arts Action Network. You can find it through Arts Alliance Illinois. If you're not already signed up for our newsletter, that is popping right now. We are given lots of information through that. So highly recommend signing up for that to get regular updates from us about what's happening and to join in on advocacy work, because as you all know, there is a lot of advocacy work that needs to happen right now for our sector to survive and be a part of a thriving future for Illinois here. Thank you so much, Jason Horowitz, for joining us. Super appreciate you. Understand this is an incredibly dense topic and very difficult to try and cover everything in a short amount of time. So thank you for that. And thanks for looking for answers for some of these additional questions that we don't have answers for yet.
Sure, it was my pleasure.
Yeah. And of course, thank you to Demi Vinkoff, the man behind the magic, who is running all of our technology, and Time Bricky for that awesome performance there at the beginning that brought a smile to my face. Claire, you want to say anything to take us out?
No, thanks to our stalwart moderator, Chris Aldane, as usual,
Yes.
making the questions happen. He's been a partner in crime to the Alliance and to me for a long time. But yeah, we really look forward to continuing to work with the state as we know this is going to be a more gradual than we want to be recovery for this sector. So Jason, appreciate your personal advocacy and your passion for this work and your partnership as we move forward.
Absolutely.
Thanks, everybody.